Hello, Steve. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you today?
Pretty good. I'm in LA. It's sun is shining, and I'm very excited for the day today. It's so heartwarming to see everyone. So
Of
that's
course.
uh that's helping given the awful year that we're having yet again. So that's super cool. Thank you so much for being here, Steve.
Good.
I'm just gonna let you take over now.
Of course. And thank you for organising today and also for keeping on top of the time. I know that's always challenging. Um, Hi, friends. My name's Steve Bromley. Today, I'm really glad to be joining you to talk about games user research with the focus on impact. How can we make sure that teams are paying attention and listen and understand our findings? A little bit about my background. So I am a games user researcher. I've worked in the games industry for a bit over a decade. I was at PlayStation for some time. I'm now a consultant. I help teams run playtests and also integrate user research into how they're running. I also ran the IGDA's Games User Research Mentoring Scheme for 5 years, and so have spent a lot of time talking to both individuals and teams about many of the common challenges that they encounter when running games user research. I've been lucky enough to be credited on some games that people love. I've been still lucky, I think, to be credited on some games that people are ambivalent about, and I've been unlucky enough to, like many people in the games industry, not be credited on many things, but that's okay. And you might also be aware of some of the things I've put out into the world, like the book How to Be a Games User Researcher, Playtest Kit, my new mini book about Playtest Plus. Essentially, I want to help people be able to run games user research, whether they are doing it as the sole part of their career, whether it's just a small part of what their role is, essentially integrating player research and insight into the development process. Today, we're going to talk about a small slice of that with that focus on impact. I want to share my mental model around games user research and framing that around risk so that we make teams care about what we're doing and see the relevance of it. I then want to turn that lens back on ourselves and look at that risk that people who are doing user research, whether you are a user researcher or a UX designer or any sort of designer doing some sort of research activity, some of the challenges that you'll face. Um, I'd like to talk a bit about how we help throughout the game development process and the type of impact we can bring to our teams, and then just share some tips, some problems that frequently come up when I'm talking to teams or individuals about why is no one listening to our research? Why are we not getting through to them? Some tips and some best practice around that. But yeah, let's start with my mental model around this and that framing around risk. As I'm sure you know, game development is very risky. Every week, hundreds of games are released on Steam, and it's really difficult for a game to stand out in that environment. Most of those games end up selling less than 100 copies, and ultimately, most studios fail after releasing their first game and close down. That is a challenge and something that we believe UX best practice and user research can help improve. When I look at why these games are failing, there are three angles that I think are particularly relevant. First of all, production risk. Can teams actually make the game? And they'll be working with producers to take steps to mitigate that, such as implementing iterative development practices, prototyping, defining the vision and making sure the team's aligned behind the vision of the game to avoid that production risk of we actually don't make a game by the end of launch. There's the market risk. If we made this game, would anyone actually buy it? And again, a lot of marketing teams are focused on that, working out the market size, working out the purchase behavior of their players, building a community, doing marketing activities are all steps to de-risk that. Where I think as user researchers and UX professionals, our focus is best spent is on experience risk. The team make a game, there is a market for it, but actually, is the game hitting the needs of these players? Is it enjoyable? Is it fun? Do players understand what they're meant to do? If we're not reaching that, we're going to create poor retention, poor word of mouth, poor reviews, ultimately making game development a lot harder. Now, game development has always had some practice around this, and we're not starting from scratch. You're probably familiar with the idea of playtesting. Ever since the 70s, when Carol Cantor was going around arcades with Atari, looking at what players are doing, game development has playtesting as a core part of its practice. put players in front of the game, see what's working or what's not working, and then make some changes based on that. However, again, applying our professional UX and user research lens on this, we see that typical playtesting practice has a number of flaws. And I spent some time a few years ago interviewing game developers about that practice and noticed some themes. Things like playtesting with the wrong players, just getting people from around the studio or getting their friend or their family to take a look. Again, there are real reasons why teams do this based on constraints and budgets and issues, but as user researchers, we know this is a problem. Similarly, running the studies too late, um, making sure that they're not leaving time to address the issues they're finding is very common. Using inappropriate methods, relying on often very heavily self-reported data, such as surveys or just typing some feedback into Discord, again, won't meet our standard of user research best practice. And then not having the background knowledge or approach to work out how to do an unbiased study design or unbiased analysis of that. When we look at adding all those problems that typical playtesting has, we see that ultimately they're not de-risking those experience issues. Because of that, playtesting feels pointless. It's not a reliable return on teams' investment, and it falls down the development priorities. So that's where we step in. And when I start by introducing user research practice to a studio, I usually start with this framing about risk and explain that the point of games user research is we're trying to de-risk your playtesting. We're trying to control and minimize those biases and those risks to make sure that playtesting is delivering that promise of reducing development risk. Again, as everyone on this call knows, applying elements of the scientific process and knowledge of study designs and ethics and methods to get reliable data and draw reliable conclusions. It's not necessarily rocket science. A lot of people do come from with very fancy degrees or letters after their name. But really, I think it just needs time and attention and experience and the spirit of neutrality to run good user research studies. So that was a very speedy introduction to the mindset I want to introduce with user research and how we have impact with it. But then I talk to game teams, and I talk to user researchers, and I see that we're not always landing that. We have our own risks, our own reasons why our games user research isn't working. And something that spoke to me when I saw it about what this problem is this very old quote from Oscar Wilde. There's only one thing in the world worse than being talked about, and it's not being talked about. And I hear endless stories from both individual researchers and research teams about their studies being ignored, they're not being in the room when discussions are happening about how we should approach production or what our priorities for production should be. They're often not a core part of that game development process and not having the impact that we as a profession deserve to have. A couple of the impacts of that, if we're spending too much time in our bubble and learning things that aren't relevant to our game teams or failing to make that connection to our game teams, is that we're learning things too late and not leaving teams the opportunity to react to that or to address the issues that we're discovering. We're learning things that aren't actually relevant to their priorities and what they want to know and what's important to the game team, or we're failing to be understood. We think we've got some high quality conclusions that are important, but we're just not getting through to the teams that we work with. And that's particularly, I know a lot of people on this call are from outside of games or have experience of user research elsewhere. This is particularly challenging in the field of game development because games is a messy combination of business and creativity. It's very hard to define upfront what's fun or where is the fun. It's a very interdisciplinary practice with all of these different teams and more not fitting on the slides, working together with an unclear specification over a project that's going to last 3 to 5 years. It means it's very hard to actually create that shared alignment and shared agreement of what we should be learning and what we should be doing, much more so than in many other fields, I believe. So the spirit that we have to bring to our user research practice is probably best summed up by Erica Hall with her saying about just enough research. Our role as user researchers and as UX professionals is to make sure we're learning the most important things at the right time so that they actually impact development decisions. And for the next 10 minutes, I'd like to share some of my tips and some of the common issues that I see from user researchers about how exactly we can do that. Which brings me to my top 5 tips for impacts. The first step is to reflect on our scoping of our studies. What do we actually want to learn when we run this study, and uh, what are we going to learn when we run this study? Now, you're probably familiar with the game development process and how, although it is different between studios, they have different terms and for these milestones and often different deliverables at milestones. It's vaguely something like this, where teams start with that process of ideation, working out what's fun and what can we build a game off. They go through pre-production to show that they can scale making that game into a full experience. Then production, where they're actually building the game for real, building out all the assets, all the things that the team that essentially make a game before going through a polishing period. And we as researchers can then match our understanding of what we should be doing and what our teams need to learn from us to these milestones. I'll share a link to how you can get a copy of this picture later. But once we understand what our teams are trying to do in each of these development stages, we can then use that to inspire what type of studies should we be doing early on, making sure that we are helping teams define their players, work out what interactions are fun, work out what are the core elements that can be built together into a game, all the way to that post-production or post-launch work on balance and retention and making sure that the game essentially has that pacing and that experience that players want throughout. So that first step involves understanding what our teams want to know from a study. However, often we're not doing that. When I've spoken to both user researchers and game teams about, okay, actually, when are you running user research studies? When do they happen in your production process? Very commonly, they're synced with milestones. As you might have noticed on a couple of slides back, game development goes through those stages of having an alpha milestone where they'll often put a build together at that point and a beta milestone. And that's usually the inspiration of when teams are deciding to run their studies. Now, that's not ideal. That's leading to big bundled up tests where they want to learn everything in one giant study aligned with that milestone and are more doing the testing at that stage as a box ticking exercise rather than looking at that true spirit of research, which is understanding what you want to know today and then coming up with an answer in a timely and relevant fashion. So instead, we need to focus on pushing our game teams beyond just running studies at milestones and instead make them recognize the hypotheses behind the decisions they're making. Every day, game designers, level designers, producers, artists are making decisions about the game. Those can be big decisions like what is the genre? What should the story be? Or they can be tiny decisions like how should we highlight the weak spot on this enemy? Or how should we hint players towards the right solution to this puzzle? Now, each of those decisions has some hypotheses within it about what do we think players are going to understand? What do we think players are going to do? And if we push our teams to recognize that their design decisions have hypotheses within them and get them to and help them to articulate those hypotheses, those are the raw building blocks we can use to build impactful studies. You can then take that potentially huge list of decisions that the teams are making, probably found through their stand-ups or through retros about what they're working on currently, and do some sort of prioritization process to help them land on which ones are actually worth testing. Looking at, is this a core thing that players actually have to do, or is it a secondary feature? Are we able to act on what we learn from this study if we do learn there are some problems? And is it a domain that we already know well? Obviously, we're working with expert designers and experts in their fields already. And if they've made this thing 100 times before, that's less of a priority than them trying something new or novel, which should be more of a priority for our user research studies. In this first tip, what I hope I've conveyed to you is that having impact requires understanding the decisions the teams are making, not just running tests aligned to the big milestones as teams are often inclined to do, but instead sitting with them, understanding what their decisions are that they're making each day are, helping them articulate those as hypotheses, prioritize them, and then use that to inspire when we're running studies so that we make sure that what we're learning is actually relevant to what they're doing today. My second tip, and an area where I do see teams go wrong again, is making sure that we're focusing on communication. Uh, a naive view of the role of a user researcher would be we go away, we run a study, and we write a lovely report, and then we hand over the report to the team. We have to continue to remind ourselves that the report isn't the point. Our job isn't to go and write reports. Who would pay for that? Our job is to help teams make informed decisions about the type of game challenges that they've come across. That means that as a first step, hey, just writing a report isn't good enough. That's not what we should be doing here. And also, what we're learning isn't important either. If I, as a researcher, know the best option to take or the best I don't know where the usability issues are, that's no good to the team as a whole because I'm not making design decisions. It's producers and game designers and artists and level designers who are making those decisions. So instead, our role as researchers should be to elevate our team, help make sure they understand this information, however we achieve that, whether that is a report or another method, and make sure that they have all the information they need to act on this. Our goal essentially is to achieve shared understanding, not just learn stuff for our research team, but success should be judged on actually the understanding that our colleagues in other disciplines have. Now, we don't have a huge amount of time to go into detail about how to do this, but some of the techniques that teams will use to try and achieve this include making sure we're co-setting objectives. If you, as a researcher by yourself, are coming up with, here's what I think we should learn from this study, that's often a sign that you're not completely in sync with the team and what the team's priorities are. And so making sure that the team, your colleagues from other disciplines, are the ones setting the objectives for your study is super important. You can also look at techniques of opening up the research sessions, making live streaming possible, encouraging and making it possible for teams to come and view your sessions, running activities to give them the opportunity to reflect on what they've seen during those sessions. Those type of things to make the research real rather than just a report are very important. And again, once you build up a degree of trust with your team and are in a good place with them, you can take that even further and make the analysis of research data a collaborative practice rather than you just going off into your research cave, writing up what you learned and coming back with a complete answers. You can involve the team in prioritizing and understanding what's important from the test. So this second point I wanted to cover is that impact requires making sure we're understood. Just writing the report isn't good enough. Instead, we need to be making sure that our teams have understood it and are in a position where they can act on it. A third point I want to flag, and another challenge I see teams have, is making sure that our research is delivered in a timely fashion by speeding up analysis. Now, as everyone who works in games knows, game development is an extremely time pressured environment, and our game teams aren't going to wait. All that time we're spending analyzing our data, writing our lovely report, putting the clip art in, teams are just going to carry on building stuff, making decisions. They're going to make that decision with or without you. And we need to make sure that we're keeping up with that. As a consequence, during my time at PlayStation, that led us to try and optimize our analysis process and make sure that we were giving teams their initial results within 24 hours of the study ending. So as soon as we'd seen that last participant, 24 hours later, we would have something we can share with the team. The way we achieved that was through mind maps. Rather than, in addition to creating the report later on, optimizing how we're collecting data through the use of mind maps, optimizing the analysis process through the use of mind maps, and then using that as a presentation tool meant that we could give teams steers very early on in development. Again, this is a very short session today. I've gone in detail on how to use mind maps to get in front of game design decisions in a talk a few years ago. If you Google mind maps get in front of game design decisions, you'll find a video from a previous conference of me talking about this. So, although long-term storage is important and we should be writing reports, that's important as well. Our primary goal should be informing decision makings, and because of that, we need to optimize our analysis process through techniques like mind maps, as I've covered then. I'm aware we've got 6 minutes. That's the perfect amount of time to cover my last 2 points. Another challenge I see teams having is that they're oversharing and they're not prioritizing what to share, leaving the signal to noise ratio from a research study very difficult for teams to interpret. We can't share everything. It's very tempting for us because we put so much effort into running a study, collecting this lovely data, doing this analysis to share everything we've learnt. But people can't hear everything. They won't hear everything. And that's not because they're bad or they don't care. That's just how people work. We need to focus on storytelling, and part of storytelling is limiting the number of things we share to encourage teams actually to act on what we've heard. There's a small part of that is making sure we're prioritizing the most important things. There's a key that I often use for prioritizing usability issues. There's a similar one that I use for more experiential issues, which if you Google how to prioritize playtest issues and find the blog post, it will go into it in a lot more detail than I have time for today. But the ethos here is to make sure that we are being careful and selective with what we share based on what's most important and relevant to our teams. That goes further into making sure that we're making different cuts for different people. What the member of the executive committee needs to know is completely different to what the lead designer needs to know, which is completely different to what the marketing team needs to know. And it's on us to make sure that we are picking out the findings that are relevant for each of these audiences and making sure that we're communicating that in a compelling manner to encourage teams to actually take action based on it. My last point today is looking back at our research process itself and how can we make sure that we're doing the best job we possibly can. So game development, as we've very briefly mentioned, is an iterative process. But beyond that, we need to recognize that iteration is also important for us as researchers. After every study we're running, we need to be making sure we're reflecting on how did that study go? What went well? What were the challenges? Agnostic to the actual conclusions from the study and what we're telling the teams, we need to look at our research process. And something that I encourage the teams I work with to do is to run a post-mortem focused on their research process after every study, looking at what went well and what were the challenges before the study and what actions we're going to do differently to address that. Same during the study and same in analysis and debriefing. That means that no matter where your research team is starting from and your level of maturity as an organization, you're continually iterating, continually optimizing, and you will end up as a much stronger and impactful team. And you can combine that with a knowledge base, a way of writing down, here's how we do these things. Here's how we best recruit participants and best screen them. Here's how we best communicate our results to the marketing team, making sure that you are putting time, for example, on a Notion dashboard to document how we do our work, and reviewing that regularly and updating it based on postmortems will help your team grow. Now, this is a very cut down version of this topic, and there's a whole bunch more we could talk about in relation to this. Some things I'm going to point you towards to help in the future. I've written a couple of blog posts, and I'll share a link in a second. But I guess the first thing is to reflect on your research process and make sure that you do have a defined research process, that you're following these steps, that you've written down how you're doing it and you're iterating it. Make sure that you are learning how to run good studies and how to have impact, and any best practice that you discover does get captured. I also shared earlier that picture of how the what game teams are focused on throughout development and how our research practice and our focus should be aligned with that and how it would differ throughout development. Again, I think that's a very useful graphic to help us reflect on where we should be helping. And to get all of this, I publish a lot on the website gamesuserresearch.com. You'll find blog posts about all of these subjects. And also, I mentioned the mini book earlier. I've released a mini book called Playtest Plus, which is aimed at non-specialist user researchers to help them work out when they should be doing user research and how best to do it throughout development. That book is free on the website if you go and find it. Also, I love talking about user research and appreciate the opportunity today. So if you have any questions, either as an individual or as a team, about how to have more impact with your research studies, do get in touch. I've shared my email address here. I think I'm still on Twitter, as far as anyone's still on Twitter, if it still exists, but I've shared my Twitter ID. We're probably out of time for questions, and I know Celia has another speaker lined up, but thank you so much for your time today. And do keep in touch after. I would love to hear from you. Thank you very much.